video about Western resolve with regard to supporting Ukraine in defending itself against the illegal Russian invasion. So Vladimir Putin, he believes that the West is limp-wristed, and in this he's not entirely mistaken. That eventually Westerners will get tired of hosting Ukrainian refugees, will get tired of the cost of arming Ukraine, and will grow fed up of the economic burden caused by the increased oil and gas prices and so on. And he thinks also if he can just string the war out, a protracted war, he will eventually win. One of his inspirations, ironically enough, is the Taliban, which he regarded as a terrorist organization, which he said was anathema. So obviously Putin is a huge advocate of the Soviet war crimes in Afghanistan, which were committed on a huge scale in the 1980s, partly because some of the people who later became the Taliban were so horrific, and some of them were horrific. Um, Not to say that NATO committed no war crimes in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. It did, but I think maybe not so horrendous, or maybe not quite the same scale. There surely has been no armed conflict in which no crime has been committed by either side. So we can't talk in terms of absolutes. It's relatives. But back to this thing. So he thinks that Taliban, by just protracting the conflict by 20 years, eventually the Occidental countries got fed up and decided to pack up and go home, seeing this as a forever war. There was no end in sight. $2 trillion later, something like 4,000 NATO soldiers killed. Now, bear in mind that the total population of NATO is something huge, like 700 million. I know each life for that family, that person is irreplaceable, that person is sacred. But putting all that aside for a moment, striving to be objective, this was a low fatality figure. 4,000 people killed out of 700 million over 20 years. 4,000 people killed would be like one day in the First World War. Well, not even. Anyway, so when populations are much, much lower. So there are already signs, unfortunately, that Putin's policy is starting to pay off. This a new prime minister of Italy, Miss Meloni, and she's more amenable to what Putin is saying. Yes, she wants to keep Italy in NATO, but that doesn't prove that she wants to keep arming and funding Ukraine. Remember, the European Union is picking up the tab. The Ukrainians need at least $6 billion per month just to sustain, well, government, just to pay salaries and so on, because they've lost at least 30% of their economy. Russia's lost about 10%. Obviously, energy prices are very high now as a result, and that means less of a disposable income to spend on everything else. And there's really no end in sight to these high energy prices. It might go on and on and on. And I know we can get in renewable energy, but that's increasing only slowly. Oil, gas, coal prices increasing exponentially, but the availability of renewable energy increasing only arithmetically. Now we will go all renewable. Is that going to be 30 years? Is it going to take longer? So phasing out Russian energy is very gradual. Remember, the United States is banning Russian oil as of the 5th of December this year. The European Union is striving to negotiate a price cap. G7 countries have agreed a price cap. Russia said it shan't sell any oil to anyone who has a price cap. We see who blinks first. Putin thinks his people are willing to suffer more. Obviously, they're not entitled to opinion. No demonstrations allowed. There are no elections. They're completely fraudulent elections, charades. Therefore, it's easier to control his people. It's easier to force them to suffer. Combination that between oppression and indeed some sort of safety valve, letting dissidents leave. So there are other signs. There was a protest in the Czech Republic about a month ago. Tens of thousands of people marching in Prague, saying, "Come on, let's end sanctions on Russia. We want affordable energy." The new government of Bulgaria is perhaps more amenable to Russia than everybody else. Of all the NATO and EU countries, they're the one that's perhaps most Russophile. Remember, it's the only country in which integration with the Soviet Union was seriously considered. Another Orthodox country and all the rest of it, despite being Russia's enemy in both world wars. I know Turkey's in NATO, but not in the European Union. And Turkey has a fairly cordial relationship with Russia, still trading absolutely normally with Russia, despite being in NATO, but that's partly because of Azerbaijan. Not to irk the Ruskies too much, otherwise Russia could aid Armenia even more. At the moment, the Russians are absolutely in no position to do so. So there are other signs, one of the most prominent US Republicans saying, well, there's no blank check for Ukraine. He didn't suggest cutting off all aid, but maybe reducing it, or it wasn't going to go on forever. So some signs of dissent. These are quite small numbers to begin with. It's the beginning of something. Depends how long this conflict goes on for. It goes on for another month, the Ukrainians will be fine. If it goes on for, say, another 8 years, it's been going on for 8 years already, then I think support for them will dry up. I don't want that to happen, but sadly, I believe that it will happen. And so Putin thinks if he can just draw it out, the West, with its short attention span, will give up. This is a low priority for them. Why should Westerners suffer so much for a faraway country of which they know little? Okay, Ukraine is relevant to Poland, it's their neighbor. It's not relevant to Canada, for instance, even though there's got a significant Ukrainian descendant community there. Other things to take into consideration, obviously, scaring people with the talk of a nuclear war. What else might be working as well for him? Well, thinking Trump might come back to the White House. There seems little chance of that, and it's not clear that then Trump would be more favorably disposed towards Putin than the current president. But yeah, there are signs that Western unity is fragmenting. This oil price cap is unclear whether that's going to work or not. Will he carry out his threat to cut off oil supplies? I suspect that he will, actually. And just what happens with the Western economies. Obviously, energy prices are an important factor, but there are all sorts of extraneous factors. There are wild cards. Things can happen. Can we use more nuclear energy? Could we go for fracking? Could we go for tar sands? Despite environmental concerns about these things, it might be a vital bridging gap, and so on. And how well Ukraine performs on the battlefield. Anyway, so that's why he thinks if he can draw it out, that really time is on his side. Obviously, the Russian people are suffering too. The Ukrainians, their population is not even a third of the Russian population. They're taking quite big casualties as well. Westerners were not told about that so much because it might be demoralizing. Depends on how Westerners find the Ukrainian refugees. So far, they all seem to be behaving very well, but somebody could do something foolish, which unfortunately we get the others a bad name, even though that's undeserved. Some people are quite prejudiced like that. So we don't know what's going to happen. There are other signs that Western unity is fragmenting. Look at some of the Democrats in the United States and the more left-wing people within the Democratic Party saying, there's got to be negotiations, there's got to be a peace offer. Even say Sir Max Hastings, formerly editor of the Daily Telegraph in the United Kingdom, a right-winger, sometime advocate for the Conservative and Unionist Party, and him saying that all wars end in negotiations. So the new Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, saying he's committed to Ukraine, yet also saying that no, he's not going to guarantee to go on arming Ukraine at the same level, the financial constraints being what they are. So that's all quite worrying for Ukraine because it desperately needs these Western weapons to carry on fighting. And so far, they're not being upgraded to longer range missiles or anything like that. So that's why Putin thinks this will be a very chilly winter for European Union countries. He's already, holding out the olive branch so that if you end these sanctions, if you stop funding Ukraine, arming Ukraine, I could turn on the oil and gas taps again, and you'd really like that cheap energy, seeing if somebody's going to break ranks. Serbia is not in the European Union. They aspire to join it, but they have a fairly cozy relationship with Russia. Could they be seen to benefit? And others people say, why do we go on suffering? The lack of solidarity. How come Hungary's got an exemption? We want an exemption. Orban Viktor, Prime Minister of Hungary, he gets a good deal for his people because he plays hardboil. He'll veto this or that. So we're such chumps. So why should we such fools to suffer avoidably when they don't? No, we'll do what's best for our country. And I feel sorry for the Ukrainians, but they're not as a high priority for me as my own people. And that attitude will start to be more prevalent. And so one by one, the sanctions could break down. So that's how it could work for Putin in the longer term. He thinks, as I say, that we're vacillating, that we're feeble, that we're invertebrate, and all the rest of it. We're too soft, we've been too indulged, have a high standard of living for too long. And he can exploit democracy. The fact that dissentient voices are allowed to be heard, that we have fair elections, that there are changes of government once in a while, that we're open societies, that his agents of influence can work there, but he can no longer pump his poison in that Russia Today channel, for example. Well, thank you so much for watching my video. Goodbye.